On the 2nd of March 1879, Kate Webster committed one of the most notorious, calculated, and brutal murders of the 19th century when she killed her employer, Mrs. Julia Thomas. The murder occurred after Kate persuaded her employer to stay one more weekend with her. It was a decision that ultimately cost both women their lives. If you enjoy content like this, please consider subscribing to my channel. And if you enjoy the video, please hit the like button to help me produce more videos like this one. Let's get into a story. Catherine Lowler was born in Killane in Ireland in 1849. The full details of her life are unclear, and her statements about her life turned out to be unreliable. Her criminal career, on the other hand, is well documented. Kate grew up in a poor family and her parents were respected and decent people, whereas even at a young age, Kate was caught stealing on numerous occasions. After her release from prison at the age of 15, she started stealing again of what would be a large amount of money, enough to buy a ferry ticket to move to Liverpool in England. Kate didn't shy away from larceny there either and was caught and sentenced to 4 years in jail. Following her release, she moved to London, where she took a job as a cleaner and at the same time stealing from boarding houses she was staying in. Kate was arrested again in 1875 and sentenced for larceny 2 consecutive times. Living up to her dishonest nature, Kate claimed many aliases to keep up with her constant moving and felonies around London, including the alias Webster. She later on stated that she was married to a sea captain called Webster, whom she had 4 children with, and they all died. None of this was ever proven. What is confirmed is the birth of her son, John Webster, in 1874. Kate claimed the father was a man named Strong, who abandoned both her and her son, and as she stated, this forced her to go back into her old theft habits to support her son. During her jail time, her son was being taken care of by a close friend, Sarah Crease. Sarah was also a cleaner, and when Sarah got sick in 1879 and couldn't work for her employer's house, Kate stepped up to replace her for a few days. It was during that time she came across with Mrs. Thomas. The employer she was temporarily working for was friends with Mrs. Thomas and was aware that she was looking for a live-in maid. The fateful introduction between Kate and Mrs. Thomas took place on January 13th of 1879. Mrs. Julia Martha Thomas was a former school teacher and twice a widower. She was living in a semi-detached house known as 2 Vine Cottages, or Mayfield Cottages. Mrs. Thomas was approximately 54 years old at the time. She was a nice, well-respected and reserved lady, but was often described by many as eccentric. She was not wealthy by any means, but wished to give that impression and dressed as such with expensive clothes and jewelry to fulfill the part. Her desire to hire a live-in maid was allegedly mainly to support the status she was trying to portray. So once she was introduced to Kate, Mrs. Thomas hired her on the spot, without acquiring any references about her character or her past. Something that would prove to be a fatal omission. The 2 women got on well initially, and Kate stated she was happy to work there as a full-time maid. But it wasn't long before things started to take a darker turn. Many reports assert that Mrs. Thomas was constantly critical towards Kate, and she disliked the quality of her work. Kate's constant visits to the pub and getting drunk at times when she was supposed to be working didn't help matters either. The whole situation made Kate very resentful towards her employer, but her bitterness grew to the point where Mrs. Thomas was scared to stay alone in the house with Kate and had to ask friends and relatives to stay over at nights with her. As it became apparent, her fearful instinct was not wrong. After enduring a month of anxious nights alone with Kate, Mrs. Thomas eventually decided to give Kate a notice of dismissal, with her last day being 28th of February 1879. Friday the 28th February came, and Kate was faced with the reality that she did not have anywhere else to go or to work for anyone. So she pleaded with Mrs. Thomas to allow her to remain to the house until Sunday, 2nd of March, and Mrs. Thomas agreed. Sunday afternoons were the time Kate was allowed few hours of work, but was supposed to return back in time to help Mrs. Thomas to prepare for the evening service at the church. Kate went to visit her son, who was staying with her friend Sarah, and went to the local pub before returning to Vine Cottages. But as per usual, she arrived late at the house, and the two women started arguing about it. Witnesses who were at the church service with Mrs. Thomas described her as being agitated, most likely due to the dispute the two had, and perhaps the fact that Mrs. Thomas was afraid of being robbed in her absence, or that Kate would somehow retaliate. When the service ended at around 9 p.m., Mrs. Thomas headed back home. Exactly how things transpired after that is uncertain. In a later confession, Kate stated that when her employer came back, they fell into another argument, and in the heat of the moment, and blinded by her rage, she threw Mrs. Thomas down the stairs. According to her story, the fall left Mrs. Thomas seriously injured. To prevent her from screaming, Kate grabbed her by the throat and strangled her to death. Some reports claim that Kate used an axe to strike her in the head and kill her, but this side of the story is not verified. From what was revealed at a later stage is that the next-door neighbor, Mrs. Ives, heard a thud, but then silence followed, so she thought nothing of it at the time. But she also reported a weird smell coming out of the house in the following days, a detail that will make sense very soon. What Kate did next goes to show the kind of inhumane evilness she had in her. The next morning, she dragged the body into the kitchen, and using a razor and a meat saw, she dismembered the head and limbs and removed the insides. As an attempt to avoid identification of the body, she boiled all the body parts in a laundry copper. In the meantime, she thoroughly cleaned the house and pretended to do normal housework chores to avoid any suspicion drawn to her. Kate then placed the body parts that could fit into a bag and a wooden box, all but the head and one foot that wouldn't fit. She threw the foot in a manure heap and placed the head in a black bag where she disposed it elsewhere. On top of these appalling events, she also pawned some of Mrs. Thomas' belongings. But she was left with the wooden box to still get rid of. 2 days after the murder, she wore Mrs. Thomas's dress and traveled to Hammersmith to visit Henry Porter and his son Richard. She befriended the Porter family in 1873 and hadn't seen them in 6 years, so when she told them she was now Mrs. Thomas, a mother and a widower, they didn't give it a second thought. Kate also informed them that she inherited a house in Richmond from a late aunt and needed to sell it along with all the furniture inside, and asked them to recommend someone who might be interested. The Porters recommended a man called John Church, a general dealer. Kate asked Richard Porter to help her carry the wooden box under the pretense that she was meeting someone to give it off to. Having no clue what the box contained, Richard Porter obliged. When they were passing Richmond Bridge, Kate somehow tricked Richard so she could be left alone. She threw the box off the bridge, and when she returned to the Porters, she said, quote, "Well, that's over." Days went by, but no one was looking or reported Mrs. Thomas as missing, as it was her habit to disappear without warning or informing anyone, and so none of her friends or relatives grew suspicious when they didn't see her for days. Kate continued to assume the identity of Mrs. Thomas. She also managed to make a deal with John Church to buy off the house and the furniture. 2 weeks after the murder, on the 18th of March, John Church arranged for men to come and collect the house belongings. Seeing all men removing Mrs. Thomas's belongings from the house, the next-door neighbor, Mrs. Ives, became very suspicious. She also found very strange the fact that the movers were calling Kate Mrs. Thomas, and immediately alerted the authorities. As Kate realized they were on to her, she escaped from the back door and managed to go all the way to her hometown in Ireland, taking her son with her. The wooden box that contained most of Mrs. Thomas's remains was fished out the next day after Kate threw it in the waters. The remains were determined to be of a middle-aged woman, but without the head they couldn't determine the identity of the body, and so they referred to it as the Barnes mystery. Henry Porter, his son Richard, and John Church also reported Kate to the authorities after they found bloody stains in the house, a letter addressed to the real Mrs. Thomas, and when they saw the Barnes mystery all over the newspapers, they recognized the wooden box as the one they assisted Kate to carry. By the 5th day of her disappearance, a full description of Kate Webster was circulated by the police in connection with the murder. It wasn't long before they tracked her down. On March 28 of 1879, Kate Webster was arrested and brought back to England. She was taken to Richmond police station, where she gave a statement on March 30th and was formally charged with the murder, awaiting for her trial to take place at the Old Bailey Central Criminal Court. Kate's trial took place on the 2nd of July, 1879, and it lasted for 6 days. It was a sensational trial proven by the magnitude of the public interest and extensive press reporting. Kate pleaded not guilty to the charge and accused John Church as being the murderer. Her defense challenged the fact that the human remains could not conclusively be identified as Mrs. Thomas, presenting the evidence as purely circumstantial. It was a weakness that her defense sought to capitalize on, especially because without the head, there was no method to positively identify her at the time, as no DNA testing was available back then. But the prosecution provided medial evidence to show that all the body parts had belonged to the same person and that they were from a woman in her 50s. The defense then tried to suggest that Mrs. Thomas could have died of natural causes in view of her agitated state when she was last seen alive at the church service on the fateful night. The prosecution brought forward a number of witnesses who pieced together all the circumstantial evidence, creating a whole picture of the events that led to Mrs. Thomas's murder and subsequent disposal and identity theft. John Church and Henry Porter testified against Kate, conveying all the details that transpired the days after the murder. John's strong alibi, as well as the fact that he assisted the police with all the information and evidence he brought forward, couldn't be argued upon by the defense and was cleared of any suspicion. One of the most important testimonies for the prosecution presented was a hat maker named Mary Darden, where she told the court that 6 days prior to the murder, Kate told her she inherited a property and expensive belongings by an aunt and she wanted to sell it. This, they suggested, was clear evidence of premeditation. The jury took only 1 hour to find her guilty. Kate probably knew the outcome of her sentence, and as her last statement prior to the sentencing, she claimed she was pregnant. Upon examination by doctors and women, the claim was dismissed as they found no evidence of pregnancy and recognized she was once again lying to avoid the ultimate sentence. The judge sentenced her to death. Before she was executed, Kate Webster made 2 statements confessing to the crime. In her first, she implicated Strong, the alleged father of her child, who she said had participated in the murder and was responsible for leading her into a life of crime. She recanted the night before she was due to be executed, making a further statement she took sole responsibility and exonerated John Church, Henry and Richard Porter, and Strong of any involvement. She was hanged on July 29, 1879 at Wandsworth Prison at 9 a.m. where the hangman used his newly developed long drop technique to cause instantaneous death. After her death was certified, she was buried in an unmarked grave in one of the prison's exercise yards. The crowd waiting outside cheered loudly as a black flag was raised over the prison walls, signifying that the death sentence had been carried out. Kate Webster was the second person to be executed at Wandsworth Prison, and the only woman out of the 135 that were hanged there. Sir David Attenborough, the famous naturalist and broadcaster, had bought the residence right next to Two Vine Cottages back in 1952. The pub adjacent to his residence and 2 doors down of Mrs. Thomas's house closed in 2007, so Sir Attenborough decided to buy the property to extend his yard. October 22, 2010. As men were excavating the property, they discovered a dark circular object on the side of the pub stables. The coroner concluded that this was indeed Mrs. Thomas's skull and recorded a verdict on unlawful killing, stating the cause of death being asphyxiation and head injury. The police called the outcome a good example of how good old-fashioned detective work, historical records and technological advances came together to solve the Barnes mystery. Until next time.